Hello everyone, my name is Krista McBrien and I'm going to be discussing the topic of the Collegiate era. The Collegiate era is also known as the Colonial era, beginning in 1636 and continuing until 1789. During this time, the colonists were seeking a new, fresh start, breaking themselves from England and Europe. The first colony in America was Virginia, which was settled in 1607 under the British sovereignty. Georgia was the last of the original 13 colonies, which was settled in 1732. Each college was different from the others due to different religions and social patterns, climates, and founders. By the mid-1700s, the population of the colonies had quadrupled from around 250,000 in 1700. Even though the colonists were leaving England to escape religion requirements, religion and the church remained a part of the daily life and thought of the colonists still. The Enlightenment period of the colonial era started around the middle of the 18th century. With the start of the Enlightenment, the colonists began turning away from the classics and what had been known previously, including having less attachment to religious observance, which was referred to as the Great Awakening. In the colonies, especially the New England colonies, everyone lived in a family unit. Within the families, there was much optimism for the future. The sons could expect to have more wealth than their fathers and could become a professional person, even if their father was a farmer. Women, on the other hand, in the colonies were limited in their roles. There were few restrictions on entering the profession in the colonies. Occasionally, the professions of lawyers, physicians, and theologians attempted to control the entry. However, rarely were credentials examined or public licenses issued. Apprenticeships were the main way to access the profession. For general education, the family was the main source of teaching, social morality, and ways of behaving, while clergymen were both preachers and teachers. There were 9 colleges which organized during the colonial era. The first colonial college formed was Harvard College in 1636, which is currently known as Harvard University. The colleges were modeled on the forms developed in Europe over the prior 500 years. The 9 colleges awarded bachelor's degrees, and if the student chose to stay on for another year or two, then also a master's. The institutions were originally created as a training ground for clergymen teaching the church doctrine. They operated by and for the purposes of the centralized church. Not until the end of the era did science begin to find a place within the colleges and curriculum. Colonists had the option to send their sons still to college in England. However, many opted against the option because of travel and the finances. So colonists then turned to the 9 colleges in the American colonies to teach and discipline their sons. In order to provide an opportunity to shape the immature youth, the colleges were also established with a residential pattern. Colleges were able to consider themselves a college and grant degrees that they chose to and when they chose to. So Harvard would begin awarding degrees first, even before it was legally incorporated. William and Mary, Harvard, and Dartmouth all had the mission of Christianizing and civilizing the indigenous people. However, few Native Americans enrolled. Approximately 50 Native Americans enrolled in Dartmouth alone between 1769 and the end of the 19th century. Even though the colleges were very closely connected with the churches, the colleges were not as much religious as educative, founding to produce educated members of society. Even with the college's presence in the colonies, providing convenience for education versus a trek to England, few young people in the colonies went to college. There were many reasons which students did not attend colleges, with the main reasons for low enrollment being the young men saw no need to go to school because formal education was not needed for a career, and also the colleges were not readily accessible due to finances required to pay for the tuition and support through the studies. The total number of residents at any of the colonial colleges was less than 100, with the graduating classes numbering in the single digits. By the end of the colonial era, approximately 1 in 1,000 colonists had been to college. Because the number of graduates were so low, the graduates did not form alumni groups or interact with each other in terms of their institutions. Girls did not attend the colleges because it was believed they could learn everything they need to know from their mothers at first, and then the rest from their husbands. Most of the students attending the colonial colleges were sons of land-owning families or of professionals. The colleges at the time were to act as a surrogate parent for the young boys and to enforce behavior that the parents might not have been able to instill. The admissions requirements were the same between the majority of the colleges, with the admissions requirements becoming more rigorous as the era progressed. Harvard required that the student applicant be able to speak both Latin and Greek. William and Mary required the same of its students, plus the applicant must be at least 15 years old. In 1745, Yale College added to its requirements, which had been similar to Harvard, that its students must possess an understanding of arithmetic. Following, Princeton did the same in 1760. There were no written admissions exams, however, the students were examined or interviewed orally by the college presidents or the tutors. The colonial students set a pattern for student life which persisted into future eras. The patterns of student life included the right of upperclassmen to haze freshmen, college responsibility for student conduct, which at the time was similar to a monastery or a reform school, and the residential nature of the colleges. In order for the colleges to fully develop, they were required to develop their own communities within themselves. Faculty members were not the same as faculty members at colleges today. In the colonial era, most faculty members were tutors who had just recently graduated from the college and were waiting for the position as ministers. The professors and the tutors at the colonial colleges tended to come from professional families. Oftentimes, the majority of the colonial colleges and tutors and the presidents would teach the student in all subjects. The president and the professor lived in their own houses. However, the tutors were not allowed to marry and were required to live on the campus and supervise the students 24/7. Toward the end of the 18th century, the institutional aspect of the academic career formed as permanent faculty was made up of professors appeared. The main differences between tutor and professors was seen in the longevity in the position. Professors were known to plan a career at a single school, whereas tutors were not likely to even stay at a college long enough to see their classes graduate. Because of the nature of the position and the little pay compared to other colonial times positions, the faculty were seen more like volunteers at the colleges engaged in public service. Curriculum during the colonial era relied on what was known at the beginning and preparing students in the classical and biblical matters. The common preparation for lawyers, ministers, and statesmen included rhetoric, classical scholarship, and the Bible, whereas preparation for commercial careers included science and mathematics towards the end of the colonial era. The colonial colleges did not offer a vast number of courses, but instead offered a few courses which were required for all students. Because the college was not for the purposes of advancing students' knowledge, but instead rather for preserving what was already known. The colonial colleges took the curriculum from Europe, changing little until the end of the 18th century. Additional imports from Europe were in the titles and names, which will still remain recognized within our current colleges. For example, the four-year baccalaureate and freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior classifications, along with the finite time blocks for classes. Viewing the first Harvard schedule, which was printed in 1638, showed that students would attend classes Monday to Saturday in their first 3 years of studies. Yale modeled its curriculum based off of Harvard, as did William and Mary, who also added science and mathematics. William and Mary College was the first of the colonial colleges to establish a professorship in science, but with all the colleges having professors of math and science by the end of the era. With the Enlightenment period beginning to reach the colleges, the importance of reason and human nature started to replace biblical studies. Instruction in the colonial era came from the tutors and the students themselves, and also the college presidents. The students were required to construct their own speeches and participate in weekly debates among themselves, which were also included in traditions in the commencement ceremonies of the era. Few textbooks had been written, especially for college teaching, until the end of the colonial era. Even though there were not formal textbooks for the colleges, each college had its own library with the books often donated by local collectors, which is what professors would use to assign readings to the students. When the textbooks did appear in colleges, they reflected the ideas of the Enlightenment and what had been written, and they had been written in English. Much of the formal instruction was conducted in Latin at the time, especially in the beginning, however, with few students speaking it outside of the classroom. The humanists were the progressives of the time, arguing against strictly religious studies. Curriculum in the colonial era evolved through the years, from the church doctrine to secular humanism to eventually one with science replacing the divine revelation. The colonial colleges were founded with a combination of public and private control, with the majority leaning more towards the private control foundation. The colonial colleges consistently had an issue with the extent to which the boards and appointed members influenced matters of the college. The board, which was often appointed by the colonial college or colonial court or the legislature, was in control of all of the important issues occurring in or affecting the colleges. For example, the board, which was appointed, would then also appoint a president to oversee and operate the colonial colleges, with the president being responsible to the board alone. The colleges founded within the colonial era were governed by outsiders, usually of clergymen or magistrates, with the only teacher represented in the governing board being the president of the college. With the majority of the college charters coming from within the colonial governments, there were few coming from outside. But those that did received their charters from elsewhere, such as royal charters from the King of England or from church organizations of the time. 30 years following the Royal Charter of King's College, the legislature in the colony of New York created the University of the State of New York to provide oversight to Columbia and New York colleges which formed later. Even though by the end of the era, faculty members gained a measure of self-governance by taking charge of the curriculum and admissions requirements, they were never able to gain much representation on the boards of trustees. Once the United States formed towards the end of the Collegiate era, the first state universities organized followed the same governance pattern established earlier in the period, with the exception of the church influence on the state universities. Finances during the colonial era were tight for individual families and also for the colleges. The colonial colleges relied on voluntary donations and combination of other sources such as church groups, subscribers or private donors, and governmental bodies to sustain themselves. Harvard, William and Mary, and Yale were the first three colleges to be established in the colonial era and were labeled as state church colleges. The term state church colleges referred to how these first colonial colleges received their funding from both public and private donations. In addition to the funding through financial donations, other colleges would receive tangible donations such as library books and the land which they were located. The governments during the colonial era would provide financial support through assigned revenues such as the ferry taxes or funds from other taxes collected. In order to make the colleges more attractive to young students, the students enrolled were often granted immunity or exemptions from taxes or military service. With all the colleges mainly operating their financial budgets and collections similarly, the College of Philadelphia stood out as unique in that they relied solely on individual subscribers to get started. Even with donations made, colleges still needed to depend on student fees. These fees included the student fees, room and board, which would also often range from 10 to 50 pounds for their survival. During the colonial period is when the colleges first started the idea of work study for students. Instead of a student being expelled from the colonial college for not being able to pay the tuition, the student would work on the campus to make up their debts. Colleges were small in the number of students they served, even at the end of the colonial era. So even with the growing popularity, they remained less influential than the churches of the time. The colleges would focus on the career preparation for ministry and public service, along with individual mobility and providing assistance in child rearing. With fewer than 5,000 people graduating from the 9 colonial colleges during the period, they did produce notable public servants helping to form the United States. 25 of the 56 Declaration signers, 31 of the 55 Constitutional Convention, the first 29 senators, 17 of the first 65 congressmen, and 5 of the first 6 presidents of the United States were college trained. The influence of college was disproportionate to their size, with only one bachelor's degree awarded per 25,000 colonists. Specialized curriculum was slow to develop in a nation where social and professional roles were not differentiated. The colonial colleges provided young men the chance for social connections, with students meeting others who would introduce them to their sisters, for example, or daughters for marriage. Commencement exercises were another outcome of the colonial college era, treating the ceremony as a rite of passage. Many of the later colleges, which developed towards the end of the era, had rules about conducting the ceremonies written into their charters. The colleges and the college graduates would serve as a symbol for community pride, distinguishing a civilized community and providing a sign of high social class. Overall, the outcomes of the colonial collegiate era demonstrates that the power of tradition. Many of the same rituals and influence remain evident throughout many college campuses even today. Here you will see the reference citation of the book used for guiding information throughout this presentation. I would like to thank you for listening, and I hope that you have learned some more about where and how colleges began in the United States through the collegiate or colonial era. Please reach out to me if you have any questions or comments regarding the collegiate era. I hope you have a nice week. Thank you.